You know, there is something to be said about arriving at the exact moment when your whole world comes tumbling down. Not a minute sooner, when you might have had a chance to change course. Not an hour later, when folks have already moved on to other business. But right at that precise instant when everything you had pinned your hopes on crumbles like old leaves in autumn. I have always believed the good Lord works in mysterious ways, though sometimes his timing can seem downright peculiar. Take Margaret Lorene Whitfield. Most folks called her Maggie, though she had not heard anyone say the name with warmth in a very long time. She stepped off that westbound train on a Tuesday afternoon in September of 1883, the kind of afternoon where the sun slants hard and golden across everything it touches, making even the shabbiest depot platform look almost beautiful for a spell. She had traveled near 300 miles with nothing but a carpet bag, a marriage contract folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, and the kind of desperate hope that comes from having precious few other choices left in a life that had already taken more than its fair share. What she found waiting was not the prosperous husband she had been promised. It was something far more unexpected. Sometimes the life we think we want is not half as good as the one we never saw coming. This here is Maggie's story, and the story of a man who understood that being right on time sometimes means arriving exactly when everything goes wrong. The Cedar Falls Depot was not much to look at. A wooden platform weathered gray by years of wind and sun, a single bench with one leg shorter than the others, and a ticket window where paint peeled in long curls like birch bark in winter. The late afternoon light fell across the boards in slanted rectangles, catching the dust that Maggie's boots stirred as she stepped down from the train car on legs that trembled from 3 days of sitting upright against a window that rattled something fierce. 3 days she had spent on that cramped seat. 3 days of sleeping with her cheek pressed against cold glass while the countryside rolled past in shades of brown and gold. 3 days of rehearsing her first words to Denton Whitmore, the man who had answered her carefully worded advertisement with promises of prosperity and partnership. 3 days of imagining a future that did not involve counting every penny twice before spending it, a future that did not taste of shame and closed doors and the bitter medicine of other people's judgment. She smoothed her blue calico traveling dress, her finest, though that was not saying much. The fabric had been washed so many times it had gone soft as old paper. The color faded to something between sky and memory. She lifted her carpet bag with hands that shook just slightly and pressed her damp palm against the marriage contract tucked inside her handbag, feeling the paper crinkle with each nervous breath she drew. The train's brass bell gave one final mournful clang as the engine hissed and prepared to continue its journey westward without her. "Miss, you would be the lady for Whitmore." Maggie turned toward the voice, hope flickering in her chest like a candle fighting drafty wind. But instead of the well-dressed gentleman she had been expecting, she found herself facing a weathered man in railroad overalls. His name was Hank Dowling, and his cap was pushed back to reveal a forehead creased with the kind of uncomfortable lines that come from carrying bad news you would rather not deliver. "I am Margaret Whitfield," she said, straightening her shoulders the way Mama had always taught her to do when trouble came calling. Spine like a fence post, chin like you are daring the wind to knock you sideways. "Mr. Whitmore is expecting me." Hank Dowling's eyes dropped to the platform boards like he had found something mighty interesting in the wood grain. He pulled a folded telegram from his pocket, then seemed to think better of it, stuffing it back without offering it to her. "Well now, miss, there has been—" He cleared his throat like a man trying to swallow bitter medicine. "Mr. Whitmore, that is to say—" Maggie's stomach dropped somewhere around her boot tops. She had heard that particular tone before. The careful, measured way folks spoke when they were fixing to deliver news that would knock the wind clean out of you. She had heard it the morning Thomas died, when the doctor came down the stairs wiping his hands on a cloth that was too white for the news it carried. "What is it?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Thank the Lord for small mercies. Whitmore took himself a wife yesterday afternoon. Had the preacher and everything." The words tumbled out in a rush, as if saying them quickly would somehow soften the blow. "Said to tell you, well, he said you arrived too late." The platform seemed to tilt under Maggie's feet like she was still on that swaying train car. She reached out instinctively, her fingers finding the rough wood of a support post, feeling splinters press into her palm like tiny accusations. Too late. 2 words. Ordinary words that people used every day without a second thought. But standing on that platform in Cedar Falls, with dust settling on her worn blue dress and the last echo of the train whistle fading into the distance, those 2 words landed on Maggie Whitfield like stones thrown from a great height. Yesterday. The words scraped past her throat like sandpaper on pine. "Yes, miss. Real sudden like." It was the Farnham girl from over Millerville Way. Her papa brought her in Monday evening, and by Tuesday noon. Hank spread his hands helplessly, like he was trying to catch something that had already fallen and shattered on the ground. Preacher said it was the quickest ceremony he had ever performed. Maggie stared at the man, trying to make sense of what he was telling her. Denton Whitmore, the man who had written such carefully polite letters about their coming partnership, who had sent money for her train passage, who had promised a comfortable home and steady companionship, had married another woman while Maggie was still trusting in his word. While she was still miles away, sleeping upright on a rattling train, dreaming of peach trees and a front porch and someone who would call her by her name without flinching. Did he say anything else? Hank's discomfort deepened, showing plain on his weathered face. He pressed a small cloth pouch into her hands, the coins inside clinking together like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "For your expenses," he said. "Getting back home." Maggie's fingers closed around the pouch automatically. Not enough for a return ticket. She could tell by the weight of it. Maybe enough for a meal and a night's lodging if she was careful. If she counted every coin the way she had been counting coins for years now, the way widows learn to count when the world decides they are no longer worth its generosity. Hank turned to go, then stopped, looked back over his shoulder with something that might have been conscience or might have been the simple human inability to walk away from someone standing at the edge of a cliff. "Miss," he said quietly, "you might be the lucky one. That man collects people the way some men collect land." Then he was gone, shuffling back toward the ticket window where other people's ordinary business was waiting. And Maggie stood alone on the platform in that slanted golden light, holding everything she owned in the world in one hand and a bag of insufficient coins in the other. Around her, the normal sounds of the depot continued as if the world had not just shifted on its axis. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Children's voices carried on the afternoon breeze, high and careless the way only children's voices can be. The train whistle gave one last fading call as it disappeared around the bend toward the next town, carrying other passengers toward futures that might actually be waiting for them. Too late. The phrase echoed in her mind like a church bell tolling for the dead. She was still standing there, trying to decide what came next, trying to remember how to make her legs work and her mind think past the roaring silence inside her head when she became aware of someone watching her. Not the casual glance of a passerby or the quick appraisal of a man measuring a woman's desperation. This was something different. Careful attention born from understanding trouble when you see it, because you have worn its face yourself. 30 feet away, a man leaned against a stack of grain sacks near the freight loading area. His dark eyes were taking in her situation with the steady gaze of someone who had seen his share of disappointments and learned to recognize them in others. He was tall, lean in the way of men who work hard for their daily bread, with sun-darkened skin that spoke of months under open sky and hands that looked like they knew their business better than they knew rest. His clothes were clean, but well-worn. Cotton shirt rolled up to show strong forearms, roped with muscle and tendon. Canvas pants that had seen honest labor in every stitch and patch. A hat that had been shaped by weather and work rather than vanity. Most men would have looked away when they realized they had been caught staring. This one did not. He straightened slowly, setting down the grain sack he had been checking for holes, and walked toward her with a measured pace, unhurried and deliberate. His boots made soft sounds on the wooden platform, steady as a heartbeat. "Ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat, not in the flashy way of a man trying to impress, but with simple courtesy. "Could not help overhearing your situation." Maggie lifted her chin, preparing to deflect whatever combination of pity and improper suggestions might be coming her way. She had heard plenty of both during her journey west, though most men had at least waited until they were sure she was truly stranded before making their offers. "I am managing just fine, thank you." The lie tasted bitter as medicine, but it was all the pride she had left. And pride was the one thing nobody had managed to take from her yet. Not Thomas's mother with her accusations, not the neighbors with their whispers, not Denton Whitmore with his broken promises and his bag of insufficient coins. "I'm sure you are, ma'am." His voice carried no mockery, no pity either, just a kind of steady calm that made her look at him more carefully, the way you look at something when the light changes and you realize it is not what you first assumed. "But I have got peach trees dying for want of help. And you look like someone who knows the value of honest work." Maggie blinked, certain she had misheard him. Of all the things she had expected to hear standing on that dusty platform, an offer of employment was not among them. "I beg your pardon. Got a homestead about 3 miles out. Orchard is in trouble. This summer's drought has been mighty hard on everything that grows. Could use someone who is not afraid of getting their hands dirty." He paused, studying her face with those dark eyes that seemed to notice everything and judge nothing. "Pays not much, but there is a roof over your head and 3 meals a day." It was not charity. She realized that with a start of surprise that felt almost physical. It was business. Practical and honest, offered the same way a man offers a handshake, with straightforward intention and no hidden conditions. "You do not know the first thing about me," Maggie said carefully. "Know you traveled a long way to get here. Know you are not the crying type, even when you have got good reason to be. Know you are still standing straight when a lot of folks would have crumpled by now." He shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed both understanding and acceptance. "That tells me what I need to know." Maggie looked around the depot platform at Hank Dowling, who had already turned his attention to a stack of shipping manifests, at the empty track where her train had disappeared like a promise dissolving into distance, at the small town beyond with its unfamiliar streets and uncertain prospects. Then she looked back at this stranger who had offered her exactly what she had not dared to hope for, a chance to keep moving forward instead of backward. "I can work," she said quietly. "Figured you could." He picked up her carpet bag without asking permission, handling it like it weighed nothing at all, though she knew for a fact it carried every material thing she possessed in this world. "Name is Bo Tierney. Folks call me Bo. Got a wagon over yonder when you are ready. Margaret Whitfield. Most people call me Maggie." "Well then, Maggie Whitfield." He was already heading toward the waiting buckboard, her carpet bag swinging easily from one calloused hand. "Welcome to Cedar Falls." As she followed him across the platform, Maggie felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite hope. Hope was too fragile a word for whatever this was. Maybe it was the possibility of hope, The way the sky sometimes lightens at the edge before dawn, and you cannot be sure yet if it is sunrise or just your eyes playing tricks in the dark. The buckboard wagon sat waiting at the edge of the depot road, a sturdy bay mare standing patient in the traces. Maggie climbed up to the seat while Bo secured her bag in the back, and as the wagon lurched forward onto the dusty road, she caught one last glimpse of Cedar Falls over her shoulder. There, stepping out of the bank on Main Street, she saw him, Denton Whitmore. She knew it was him without anyone telling her, the way you know lightning by the shape it makes against the dark. Tall, well-dressed, radiating the kind of confidence that comes from money and the certainty that the world will arrange itself to his liking. He was holding the arm of a young woman in a new cotton dress, Lenore Farnham, the bride who had taken Maggie's place. But the way Denton held her arm was not gentle. His fingers pressed into the fabric with a grip that spoke of ownership rather than affection. And Lenore's shoulders were drawn up tight toward her ears, her head bowed, her whole body curved inward like a plant that had learned to grow away from harsh light. Maggie watched for only a moment, but that moment was enough. Something cold and knowing settled in her stomach, and Hank Dowling's words echoed back to her with new and terrible clarity. That man collects people the way some men collect land. The wagon rolled on, carrying her away from the depot and the town and the man she had traveled 300 miles to marry, and Maggie turned her face forward toward the open road and the stranger beside her, and whatever was waiting at the end of 3 dusty miles. The homestead came into view as they topped a low rise, and Maggie's first thought was that it looked like something that had been loved once and was trying to remember how. A modest log cabin with a stone chimney, a small barn that had seen better days, and beyond that, rows upon rows of what must be the peach orchard Bo had mentioned. Even from this distance, she could see something was wrong with the trees. Their shapes were wrong, too thin, too bare, like hands reaching toward a sky that had forgotten how to give. "Been a hard summer," Bo said, as if reading her thoughts. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the cabin's front porch and set the brake with a sound like breaking kindling. Lost near half the orchard already. He showed her the devastation up close. Tree after tree standing like skeletons against the afternoon sky, branches bare except for a few withered leaves that rustled with a sound like old paper being crumpled by invisible hands. Stunted fruit hanging like shriveled marbles. The sweet, sick smell of rotting peaches mixing with dust. Then he brought her to the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, where the largest peach tree on the whole homestead stood like a sentinel. Its trunk was thick and gnarled with age, its roots digging deep toward the water that still flowed. And though its leaves showed the same stress as the rest, green still showed through the yellow. Life, stubborn and persistent, refusing to surrender. "This one still has got a chance," Bo said, resting his hand against the bark with a gentleness that surprised her. "Few others, too, if we can get enough water to them." "How much water?" "More than we can carry, less than we need." The cabin's interior was dim after the bright sunlight and blessedly cooler, the thick log walls holding the heat at bay like a fortress. Bo showed her the small room off the kitchen, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand, but the walls were solid and the single window had glass, not just shutters. The mattress was corn husks. She could tell by the rustling sound it made when she pressed down on it. Not the worst she had slept on, though far from the best. "$1 a week plus room and board," Bo said from the doorway, his voice matter-of-fact and businesslike. "Fair wage for fair work. That is acceptable." He nodded and started to turn away, then stopped. "Morning starts early around here. Sun up, sometimes before." After he left, Maggie sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked around the room that was now hers. It smelled of wood smoke and something else. Lavender, maybe, from sachets left behind by whoever had lived here before. someone who had cared enough about this small space to leave sweetness in it. Her eyes found something through the doorway. Hanging on an iron nail beside the cabin's front door was a key. Not a modern key, but an old one, heavy and dark with age, its bow shaped in a pattern worn smooth by what must have been generations of hands. It hung there like it was waiting for something, or someone, patient as the land itself. "What is that key for?" Maggie called out. The silence that followed lasted a beat too long. Then Bo's voice came from somewhere near the porch, carefully neutral. Nothing important. Maggie let it go. She had learned that some questions needed time before they would give up their answers, the way some soil needs rain before it will yield what is planted there. She unpacked her few belongings. The blue calico dress folded small, a spare set of undergarments sewn from flour sack cotton, the small Bible her mother had pressed into her hands with trembling fingers before Maggie left home, its leather cover worn smooth at the corners from years of holding. And at the bottom of the carpet bag, wrapped in a scrap of muslin, a small leather pouch. She loosened the drawstring and counted the coins inside the way she had counted them every night on the train, touching each one like a prayer. $38.50. Every sacrifice and small denial of the last 2 years compressed into metal and cloth. She tucked the pouch under her pillow where she could feel its small weight against her hand while she slept. Through the window, the orchard stood in the fading light, row upon row of struggling trees reaching toward a sky that had turned the color of bruised peaches, purple and gold bleeding together at the horizon. Tomorrow she would begin the work of trying to save them, one bucket at a time. She was hanging her blue calico dress on the single nail in the wall when she heard it, the sound that made her freeze with her hands still gripping faded fabric. Voices outside the cabin. Men's voices, 2 of them, raised in what sounded like argument. And one of them was asking a question that turned Maggie's blood to ice water in her veins. "I'm looking for a woman who arrived on today's train, brunette, traveling alone, with a carpet bag. She belongs to Mr. Whitmore, and he wants her found." Maggie's hand tightened on the dress until her knuckles went white. Through the small window, she could see the shapes of 2 men near the barn, one of them holding a lantern that threw wild shadows across the packed earth. And standing between them and the cabin door, solid as the log walls themselves, was Bo Tierney. His voice carried across the yard, quiet and certain as stone. "Nobody here belongs to anybody, and I would suggest you gentlemen find your way off my land before I lose my patience and my manners at the same time." The lantern swung. The shadows shifted. And then, slowly, the footsteps retreated into the darkness, taking their questions with them, but leaving something behind that settled over the homestead like frost. Maggie stood at the window, barely breathing, her fingers still wrapped around faded blue calico. In the yard below, Bo Tierney remained motionless, watching the darkness where the men had disappeared, standing guard over a woman he had known for less than 4 hours. She did not sleep much that first night, but for the first time in longer than she cared to remember, it was not fear that kept her awake. It was something else entirely, something small and stubborn that she was almost afraid to name, growing in the dark like a seed that has finally found enough water to break through the soil. Through the thin wall, she could hear Bo Tierney still awake, the soft creak of his chair on the porch boards, the patient rhythm of a man keeping watch. And on the nail beside the front door, the old iron key hung in the darkness, waiting. Maggie's palms were on fire by the time she reached the creek for the 3rd trip. The wooden bucket handles had carved grooves into her soft skin, and every step back toward the orchard sent pain shooting up her forearms like lightning finding ground. The sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge, but already the heat pressed down with the weight of something physical, something alive and deliberate, as if the sky itself had decided to test whether this woman from back east had any business being here at all. She paused at the water's edge, watching the clear stream bubble over smooth stones, and dunked her hands into the cool current. The relief was instant and absolute, the kind of mercy that makes you close your eyes without meaning to. And for a moment, Maggie simply knelt there on the creek bank with her fingers trailing in the water, and the morning sun warming the back of her neck, and the distant sound of Bo working somewhere among the trees, the steady chunk of a shovel hitting dry earth at measured intervals. The relief lasted exactly as long as it took to grip those bucket handles again. Bo worked 20 yards away, moving between the withered peach trees with the rhythm of a man who had performed this same ritual countless times. His cotton shirt had darkened with sweat across his shoulders before the first hour was finished, and his boots had worn a clear path through the cracked earth between the creek and the farthest row of dying trees. He did not complain. He did not rest. He simply moved between the water and the trees with the patience of someone who understood that certain battles were won not by strength or cleverness, but by the sheer, stubborn refusal to stop. Maggie watched him through the shimmer of morning heat and made herself pick up those buckets again. By her 6th trip, blisters had formed on both palms, round and tight, and filled with clear fluid that caught the light. By her 8th trip, one had burst open, leaving raw skin that screamed every time she adjusted her grip. She bit down hard on the inside of her cheek and kept walking. The taste of copper filled her mouth, but she did not slow, did not pause, did not give the sun, or the heat, or the pain permission to decide what she could and could not do. "Water has got to find the roots," Bo called from beside a tree that still showed patches of green among its yellowing leaves. He was crouched down, using his finger to trace a shallow depression around the tree's base. "See how the ground is shaped here?" Maggie set down her buckets and walked over, grateful for any excuse to rest her burning hands. The earth around the tree trunk was baked hard, split into jagged pieces like a broken ceramic bowl. But there was indeed a slight hollow where the main roots emerged from the trunk and disappeared into the suffering ground. "Tree has been reaching for water so long it carved out its own little basin," Bo explained without looking up. "Pour the water there and it soaks down where it is needed instead of running off across the surface." Maggie nodded and returned to her buckets, aiming for those natural basins, watching the precious water disappear into the thirsty earth with a soft gulping sound that was almost grateful. She was bending to check the soil around a smaller tree near the end of the 3rd row when something made her stop. Not a sound or a sight, but a feeling. The kind of instinct that comes from growing up in farming country, from watching her father tend his apple orchard in Virginia before the debts took it and the fever took him. She pressed her fingers into the soil at the base of the tree and brought them to her nose. Then she crouched lower, examining the trunk where it met the ground, pushing aside dead leaves and dried grass to expose the root collar. The bark there was soft, not dry and brittle like the drought-stressed trees around it, but spongy and dark, pulling away from the wood beneath in wet strips that smelled of something sweet and wrong, the odor of decay working from the inside out. "This one is not thirsty," Maggie said. Bo straightened from the tree he was watering and looked at her. "This one is sick." Maggie pulled away another strip of the corrupted bark, revealing wood stained dark brown and veined with white threads of fungus. "The roots are rotting. You can smell it, that sweet smell, like fruit left in a cellar too long. Pouring water on this tree will not save it. It will only spread the infection to the healthy roots of the trees on either side." She stood and moved to the next tree in the row, then the next, crouching at each one to check the root collar and the soil, the way her father had taught her when she was barely tall enough to see over the fence rails. 2 more trees showed the same signs. Dark, soft bark at the base. the faint, sweet stink of root rot. White threads spreading through soil that connected one set of roots to another like roads connecting towns. "If we dig a trench between the sick ones and the healthy ones," Maggie said, pointing to a line in the dirt that only she seemed able to see, "we can cut the connections, stop the rot from traveling. These 3 are lost, but the 6 on either side still have a chance." Bo walked over and crouched beside her, examining the soil she had exposed. His face changed as he took in what she was showing him, and Maggie saw something shift behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, something more like recognition, the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight alone for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to have another person reach out and take half of it. "Your father was a farmer? Orchardist. Apples back in Virginia. Before the bank took the land and the fever took him." Bo studied the fungus spreading through the soil, then looked up at her face. His expression held something she had not seen before, something beyond simple gratitude for the help. It was respect, plain and unguarded, the kind that comes from recognizing competence in someone you had not expected to find it in. "Show me where to dig," he said. They worked through the morning together, Maggie directing the trench line, while Bo drove the shovel into ground that fought back with every stroke. The soil was hard as fired brick in places, and each foot of trench required dozens of blows that sent shock waves up through the shovel handle and into Bo's arms and shoulders. Maggie followed behind, carefully severing the root connections between healthy trees and infected ones, her hands black with soil and her fingernails packed with earth that would take days to fully clean. By the time the sun reached its peak, they had isolated the 3 infected trees and dug drainage channels that would redirect water away from the compromised roots. Maggie's back ached in places she did not know she had muscles, and her blistered hands had progressed from pain to a kind of numb throbbing that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. But the trench was done, and the healthy trees on either side were still healthy. The cabin felt blessedly cool after the morning's furnace. Bo moved around the small kitchen with practiced efficiency, pulling cornmeal from a large tin container, bacon grease from a covered crock near the stove, salt from a small wooden box. His hands were perfectly steady despite the morning's hard labor, and he measured ingredients by eye and experience rather than spoons or scales. "Sit," he said, nodding toward one of the 2 wooden chairs at the small table. "You have earned your rest." Maggie wanted to argue, but her legs were already making the decision for her. She sank into the chair with a sigh that came from somewhere deeper than her lungs, somewhere in the region of her bones and the worn places in her spirit that had been holding tension for months. The kitchen smelled of old fires and bacon grease, comfortable scents that reminded her of mornings before everything became complicated. Through the doorway, she could see the front room, and hanging on its iron nail beside the door, the old key. It caught a stray beam of light coming through the window, and for just a moment it seemed to glow with its own warmth. Dark metal holding sunlight the way some objects hold memories. Bo worked at the cast iron stove, spooning batter into a hot skillet that hissed and popped when the cornmeal hit the grease. The sound was homely and real, the kind of sound that says someone is taking care of things, that food is being made and the world has not entirely lost its ability to provide. "How long have you been fighting this drought?" 3 months, maybe 4. Bo did not look up from the skillet, using a wooden spoon to check the edges of the forming cornbread. Started gradual-like, then got serious when the creek dropped 2 feet in July. And before that, this was some of the prettiest country you ever saw. His voice carried a note of loss that spoke of better times remembered in perfect detail. Peach blossoms in spring looked like pink snow on the trees. Whole valley would turn pink and white. And the smell? He shook his head slowly. Like God decided to pour perfume over everything just to remind folks that beauty was still possible. The cornbread came from the skillet in one golden piece, edges crackling slightly as it cooled. He cut thick wedges and placed 2 on a plate in front of her, along with a small crock of butter that had somehow survived the heat. The coffee came from a pot simmering on the back of the stove, dark and strong enough to stand a spoon in. They ate in companionable silence, both too hungry and too tired for much conversation. The cornbread was coarse and filling, with a slightly gritty texture that spoke of cornmeal ground fresh at the local mill. Maggie spread butter while it was still warm enough to melt, watching the golden liquid soak into the bread's rough surface. She was reaching for her second piece when she heard the sound of wheels on the road outside and the particular clip of a horse being driven with purpose through afternoon heat. Bo heard it too. He set down his coffee and moved toward the front door, pausing to wipe his hands on a dish towel with more care than the simple gesture required. The woman who climbed down from the black buggy did so with the careful precision of someone who took appearances seriously, even when there was no one of consequence to observe them. She smoothed her skirts, adjusted her bonnet, and surveyed the cabin's front yard with the thorough eye of a general inspecting contested ground before approaching the porch. Her name was Opal Beckridge, and she was the kind of woman whose spine seemed made of something harder than bone. Her black wool dress managed to look crisp despite the heat and the dust that coated everything for miles in every direction, and her gloved hands were clasped in front of her in the particular way of women who have opinions about things and are not shy about sharing them. "Afternoon, Mrs. Beckridge," Bo called from the porch, with the polite distance that neighbors maintain when they are not entirely sure whether the visit is friendly. "Mr. Tierney," her voice was crisp as autumn air, formal as Sunday service. "I hope I am not interrupting anything important." Maggie remained at the kitchen table, uncertain whether she should make herself known or stay hidden behind the comfortable anonymity of the cabin's dim interior. The decision was taken from her when Opal Beckridge's sharp eyes found her through the open doorway, cataloging everything with practiced thoroughness. The sweat stains on Maggie's dress, the dirt caked under her fingernails, the raw state of her blistered hands, the way her hair had escaped its pins during hours of hard labor and now hung in damp strands around a face flushed red with sun and exertion. "Oh, I see you have company." "Maggie Whitfield," Bo said, his tone neutral as creek water. "She is helping with the orchard work." Maggie walked to the doorway on legs that still trembled from the morning. "Miss Whitfield," Opal said with the particular chill reserved for situations that do not meet social expectations. "I do not believe we have been properly introduced." What followed was a conversation that Maggie had known was coming, had braced herself for the way a person braces for a blow they can see approaching but cannot dodge. The questions came wrapped in courtesy but edged with something sharper. Where exactly was she sleeping? What precisely were the terms of her arrangement? Did she understand how such situations appeared to people who cared about the community's moral standing? Bo's jaw tightened with every question, though he kept his voice level as still water while he answered each one. "Miss Whitfield is working to save dying trees. Nothing unconventional about honest labor for honest wages." "Of course not." Opal's smile was thin as paper and just as likely to cut. "But appearances matter, Mr. Tierney. And a young woman alone with an unmarried man, no proper chaperone or family nearby." She let the implication trail off like smoke in still air. "What would you suggest?" Maggie asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "There are proper situations available in town. Mrs. Crawford needs help with her boarding house. Very respectable work for a young woman in uncertain circumstances." "Respectable work that pays next to nothing," Bo observed. "Money is not everything, Mr. Tierney. A woman's reputation is worth far more than wages." Maggie looked between them and saw the battle lines being drawn with the clarity of someone who had spent her whole life caught between other people's expectations and her own survival. Opal Beckridge represented safety, respectability, the approved path that led to social acceptance and slow starvation. Bo represented something different. Independence, maybe. Or at least the possibility of it. "I appreciate your concern," Maggie said carefully, testing each word before she released it into the charged air. "But I have made my choice." Opal's eyebrows rose. "Have you? Or has your choice been made for you by circumstances beyond your control?" The question struck closer to home than Maggie cared to admit. She felt it land somewhere deep, sending ripples through certainties she had been building since yesterday afternoon. Opal gathered her skirts to leave, then paused on the porch steps. Her expression changed, and for just a moment the sharp edges softened into something more complicated. Something that looked almost like recognition. "I came west as a mail-order bride myself, Miss Whitfield. 30 years ago, this October. My intended died of typhoid 2 weeks before I arrived. I stood on a platform, not unlike the one you stood on yesterday, with nowhere to go and nothing to my name but a carpet bag and a whole lot of useless hope." The words hung in the afternoon air. Maggie stared at the older woman, seeing her suddenly in a completely different light, like turning a photograph and discovering a second image hidden beneath the first. "Which is exactly why I am telling you," Opal continued, her voice hardening back into its familiar steel. "This path ends badly. I have seen it end badly more times than I care to remember, and the women who walk it always pay a higher price than the men." Then she was climbing back into her buggy with the same careful precision she had used to dismount, checking her appearance in the small mirror attached to the vehicle's side, gathering the reins in her black-gloved hands. "Mr. Tierney," she called as the horse stamped impatiently, "you are walking a narrow path. Do not let pride lead you astray." The buggy rolled away, raising a cloud of dust that settled slowly in the still air. Maggie watched until it disappeared around the bend in the road, then became aware of Bo standing beside her on the porch, solid and quiet as the cabin itself. "You do not have to stay," he said. His voice was barely audible above the fading sound of the retreating buggy. Maggie turned to look at him. His face was carefully neutral, but she could see tension in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hands gripped the porch railing, as if anchoring himself against the possibility that she might actually leave. "Do you want me to leave?" "That is not what I asked." "It is what you meant." The silence stretched between them. Bo's gaze fixed on the dusty road where Opal Beckridge's buggy had vanished, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough around the edges, like sandpaper on raw wood. "Had a situation before. Different woman, different circumstances. But people talked then too." Maggie waited. She could feel the weight of what he was about to say building in the silence between them. "Before you tell me about her," Maggie said quietly, "I want you to know something about me first. Because it matters. Because you should know who you are defending before you decide if she is worth the trouble." Bo turned to look at her, and in his dark eyes she saw something that might have been surprise. Or maybe it was just the recognition of one wounded person seeing another decide to take off the bandage. "My husband's family told everyone I stole from them after Thomas died. Every penny he had saved, they said I took it. There was no money. There was nothing to take. But a lie from a respectable family travels faster than the truth from a widow with no name. Every door in town closed. I put an advertisement in the paper because I had run out of doors to knock on." The porch boards creaked softly as Bo shifted his weight, but he did not speak. He simply listened, standing firm and letting her words pass through the silence without interruption. Bo was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he spoke, and his words came slow and deliberate, each one weighed before it was released. "Her name was Ada Greer. Met her at a church social about 3 years back when I was still trying to make my first farm pay. Pretty girl. Sweet disposition. Had clear ideas about how life should go, the kind of ideas that do not leave much room for drought or debt, or the 100 ugly surprises farming throws at you when you are already on your knees. His mouth curved in a smile that held more understanding than bitterness. Problem was, I could not give her those things. Not then. Drought hit that summer too, though not as bad as this one. Lost most of my crops. Had to sell the livestock to cover debts. Ada. She listened to people like Mrs. Beckridge. Decided her reputation was worth more than whatever we had building between us. Married a banker in town. Safe choice. Respectable. And died in childbirth 2 years later. Baby too. The words fell between them like stones dropped into deep water. Maggie felt them hit, felt the ripples spread through her chest. Bo picked up his coffee cup, which had gone cold on the porch railing, and turned it slowly in his hands. I did not fight for her, he said. That is the part that stays with me. I let other people's voices be louder than my own. Let their opinions carry more weight than what I knew to be true. She walked away, and I let her go because I thought that was the noble thing, the right thing. Turned out it was just the cowardly thing. He looked at her then. Straight on, no flinching, no hiding behind the wall she had sensed around him since the moment they met. I will not make that mistake again. The simple sentence carried more weight than any promise spoken over a Bible. Maggie heard it for what it was. Not a declaration of anything so simple as love or even attraction, but something more fundamental. A decision. A line drawn in dust and drought and the hard soil of lived experience. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light change and the shadows grow longer. And something between them shifted like ground settling after a long thaw, finding a new position that felt more solid than what had come before. The trees need watering again, Maggie said finally. They do. Then we had better get to it. They walked toward the orchard together, boots raising small puffs of dust in the packed earth. The peach trees waited in their patient rows, and the late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of amber and gold that made even the dying things look like they were holding on to the last of something beautiful. Maggie picked up her buckets from where she had left them beside the large tree, wrapping her torn palms around the handles with a grimace she did not try to hide. The pain was sharp and immediate, but it was honest pain, earned through useful work, and she had learned to tell the difference between pain that destroys and pain that builds. She had just poured water around the base of the fourth tree when she noticed something that made her set the buckets down and crouch low, examining the ground between the rows with the same careful attention she had given the root rot that morning. Footprints. Fresh ones, pressed deep into the hard-packed earth, deeper than her boots or bows would make. A man's boots, large, with a distinctive heel pattern that had left sharp impressions in the soil between the third and fourth rows. The prints went straight through the orchard, pausing at several trees as if the person had stopped to examine them, then continued toward the property's western boundary before disappearing into the scrub brush beyond the fence line. Someone had walked through the orchard during the night. Someone who had no business being there. Someone who had moved with deliberate purpose, not the wandering path of a lost traveler or the quick straight line of someone cutting across property to save time, but the careful, methodical route of someone surveying, measuring, evaluating what was here and what it might be worth. "Bo!" Maggie called, keeping her voice steady despite the cold that had suddenly settled in her stomach. "Come look at this." He came quickly, reading her tone the way a man reads weather, and crouched beside her to examine the prints. His face changed as he traced the heel pattern with one finger, his jaw setting into a hard line she had not seen before. "These were not here yesterday," Maggie said. "No." Bo stood slowly, his eyes following the trail of prints toward the western fence line and the open country beyond. They were not. He did not say who he thought had made them. He did not need to. The prints told their own story, and it was a story about a man who believed he owned things that were not his to own, who walked through other people's property in the dark of night with the casual confidence of someone who had already decided that boundaries and fences and the word no were obstacles meant for lesser men. Maggie looked at the footprints in the dust, then at the struggling trees, then at Bo Tierney, standing beside her with his jaw set and his dark eyes holding something that was equal parts anger and determination. Somewhere beyond the western fence line, the last light of day was bleeding out of the sky like water soaking into thirsty ground. And in the distance, so faint it might have been imagination, Maggie thought she heard the sound of a horse moving through dry brush, unhurried and deliberate, heading back toward town. The night settled over the homestead like a held breath, and Maggie lay on her corn husk mattress in the small room off the kitchen, listening to the thousand small sounds of a house and a land she was only beginning to know. The creak of cooling timbers, the distant call of a night bird she could not name, the whisper of wind through peach leaves that sounded like pages turning in a book written in a language she had not yet learned to read. And beneath her pillow, the small leather pouch containing $38.50 pressed against her hand like a heartbeat, steady and persistent, counting down toward a future she could not yet see. Through the thin wall, she could hear the soft creak of Bo's chair on the front porch. He was keeping watch again. She went into town the next morning. Bo needed salt for curing and oil for the tools, and Maggie offered to make the trip because her legs needed stretching beyond the orchard rows and because some part of her wanted to see Cedar Falls in daylight, to understand the geography of this place she had landed in. The general store smelled of leather and tobacco and the particular dusty sweetness of dry goods stored in wooden bins. Maggie was examining a sack of salt near the back counter when the door opened and the quality of light in the room changed. The way light changes when something large moves between you and the sun. Ah, the mail-order bride who arrived a day late. She knew the voice before she turned, cold and measured and smooth as oiled leather, the voice of a man who had never once in his life been told no by anyone who mattered. Denton Whitmore stood in the doorway of the general store, filling it with a presence that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with the particular gravity that money and power exert on the spaces they enter. His clothes were pressed and clean, his boots polished to a shine that seemed almost offensive in a town coated with dust. His eyes moved over Maggie with the thoroughness of a man appraising property. "Contracts do not expire just because one party arrives late," he said. Maggie set the salt down on the counter. Her hands wanted to shake, but she would not let them. She straightened her spine the way Mama had taught her. Fence post, chin up, dare the wind. "Our contract died the moment you said your vows to another woman, Mr. Whitmore." Something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger exactly, something colder. The irritation of a man accustomed to obedience discovering that a piece on his board has moved without permission. "We will see what the law has to say about that." He smiled, and the smile did not reach his eyes, did not reach anything human at all. And then he turned and walked out of the store with the unhurried stride of a man who has all the time in the world, because time is something he can afford to buy. Maggie stood motionless until her heartbeat slowed. Then she picked up the salt and moved toward the counter, and that is when she saw her. Lenore Farnham, Denton Whitmore's new wife, standing on the boardwalk outside the general store. She was younger than Maggie had expected, barely 20, with a face that should have been pretty but was drawn tight with something that lived behind her eyes and never fully left. She was adjusting the sleeve of her dress, pulling the cuff down over her wrist with the quick, practiced motion of someone who has performed this particular gesture so many times it has become automatic, but not quickly enough. Maggie saw the bruise, purple and yellow at the edges, wrapping around Lenore's wrist like a bracelet made of violence. The kind of mark left by fingers that grip too hard and hold too long. Fingers that believe they have the right to leave their signature on another person's skin. Lenore looked up and their eyes met through the store window. In that single moment of connection, Maggie saw everything she needed to understand about Denton Whitmore and the kind of man he was behind his pressed clothes and polished boots. Lenore's eyes held fear and exhaustion and something else, something that looked like a plea, written in a language that only women who have known a certain kind of helplessness can read. Then Denton's voice called from somewhere down the boardwalk, sharp as a slap, and Lenore flinched like a horse shying from a raised hand. She pulled her sleeve down and turned away, and the moment broke like thin ice over deep water. Maggie stood in the general store with salt in her hands and ice in her stomach, understanding now with perfect clarity what Hank Dowling had meant when he said that man collects people the way some men collect land. Understanding what she had been saved from by arriving one day too late. Understanding what Lenore Farnham had not been saved from at all. She rode back to the homestead in the late afternoon heat with the supplies rattling in the back of the borrowed wagon and Denton Whitmore's threat rattling in her mind. Bo was waiting on the porch when she pulled up, and one look at her face told him everything he needed to know. That evening, they sat on the porch in the dying light, and Maggie told Bo about the encounter, about Denton's threat, about Lenore's bruise, about the cold certainty in Denton's eyes when he spoke of contracts and law, the certainty of a man who believed that paper could make people into property. Bo listened in silence, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold. And when she finished, he stared out at the orchard for a long time before speaking. Some men, he said quietly, believe the world was built for their convenience. Every person in it, just another thing to be used. Every law, just another tool for getting what they want. The night air carried the smell of dust and dry grass and the faint sweet rot of dying peaches. And somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called out, high and lonely and unanswered. The thunder came on Thursday afternoon like a rumor traveling across the valley. Maggie heard it first. A low, distant rolling that might have been a wagon crossing a wooden bridge somewhere beyond the western hills, except that it went on too long and carried a vibration she could feel in the soles of her feet through the hard, packed earth. She set down her buckets and straightened, pressing one hand against the small of her back where the muscles had knotted into something that felt permanent, and tilted her face toward the sky. Still blue, still cloudless, still that same merciless ceiling of heat and light that had been pressing down on them for days. But something had changed. The air felt different against her skin, thicker somehow, charged with an energy she could not name but recognized the way a body recognizes water when it has been thirsty long enough. "Storm coming," Bo said. He was standing perfectly still between the fourth and fifth rows, his head tilted back, listening to something beyond the thunder, something that lived in the space between sounds. His whole body had gone alert, every muscle quiet but ready. "You sure about that?" Maggie shaded her eyes and scanned the western horizon. Nothing but shimmer and blue and the same baked emptiness that had been staring back at them all week. "Smell the air." Maggie breathed deep. At first there was nothing but the usual mixture of dust and dying vegetation and her own perspiration. Then carried on what might have been the faintest stirring of breeze she had felt since arriving in Cedar Falls. She caught something else. Something green and sweet and alive, the way earth smells when it is remembering what rain tastes like. "Rain," she whispered, "still a ways off, but it is coming." Bo was already moving, his earlier measured pace replaced by something urgent and purposeful that transformed him from a patient farmer into something closer to a man preparing for battle. Need to get every container we can find. Every bucket, basin, pot, and pan. The next hour passed in a whirlwind of preparation that left no room for exhaustion or blistered palms or aching backs. They dragged containers out of the cabin, the barn, the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor. Anything that would hold water became a soldier in their desperate army. Maggie found herself running between buildings with an energy she should not have possessed after days of brutal labor. Her earlier weariness burned away by the electricity that was building in the air like a promise being gathered before it is spoken. A wash basin from behind the cabin, 3 buckets from the barn, one with a crack that Bo sealed with a strip of canvas, and a prayer. A large pot with a dented bottom that would still hold precious rainwater. Even an old porcelain bathtub that Bo hauled from somewhere behind the barn, its surface stained yellow and brown, but structurally intact. The western sky began to darken as they worked, clouds building like mountains on the horizon, white at first and innocent-looking, the kind that promised shade but little else. But as Maggie watched, their bases turned gray, then the color of wet slate, then something close to black, pregnant with moisture this land had been craving for months. Lightning flickered deep inside the cloud mass. Not the sharp, dangerous bolts that mean the storm is already upon you, but the diffuse internal glow that speaks of power still gathering, still building, still deciding exactly where and when to release itself. How much time do we have? Hour, maybe less. Bo was arranging vessels in patterns around the yard, calculating angles and water flow with the instinct of someone who understood that every drop would matter. These summer storms build fast once they get going. The air pressure dropped. Maggie felt it in her ears, a hollow, muffled sensation that made the world sound like it was being heard through water. The horses in Bo's small pasture began moving restlessly, lifting their heads and snorting, their instincts reading the sky with a literacy older than human language. The first real breeze arrived like a scout running ahead of an advancing army. It stirred the dust in small whirlwinds and set the peach leaves chattering with a sound like applause, like the whole orchard was greeting something it had been waiting for. Maggie's hair, already loose from the day's work, whipped across her face in damp tendrils that stuck to her skin. Thunder crashed overhead, close enough to rattle the cabin windows, and the lightning that followed came only a heartbeat later, illuminating the yard in stark white relief that made every shadow knife sharp and every surface brilliant. In that split second of electric daylight, Maggie could see the storm approaching across the valley like a dark wall, rain falling in gray curtains that erased the distant hills as completely as if they had never existed. "Here it comes," Bo said. The first drops landed fat and warm and widely spaced, each one a small individual miracle of wetness striking parched ground. Maggie felt one hit her forehead, then another on the back of her hand, each impact leaving a dark spot on her skin that evaporated almost instantly in the residual heat. Then the scattered drops became a patter, and the patter became a drumming, and the drumming became a roar as the sky opened with the sudden, overwhelming generosity of something that has been holding back for far too long. Within seconds, Maggie was soaked to the bone. The rain fell with a force that stung her upturned face and plastered her work dress to her body and ran in streams down her neck and under her collar. But she did not care. After days of carrying water 1 bucket at a time across cracked earth, the sensation of it falling freely from the sky in sheets and curtains and great silver cascades felt like something closer to grace than weather. She stood in the middle of the yard with her arms spread wide and her face turned up toward the weeping sky, and she let the rain wash over her like a benediction. The water tasted of distance and high places and the promise of growing things. It tasted of mercy. Lightning cracked again, splitting the sky from horizon to horizon, and in the blinding moment of illumination, Maggie saw Bo wrestling with a large canvas tarp that the wind was trying to tear from his hands. "Help me with this." She grabbed one corner, and together they stretched it between two fence posts, creating a makeshift funnel that directed rainwater into the old bathtub below. The canvas drummed under the downpour with a sound like 1,000 fingers tapping, and within minutes the improvised system was channeling a steady stream into the tub that rose inch by inch toward the rim. Maggie watched the water level climb with something approaching euphoria. Their desperate bucket-carrying efforts of the past days multiplied 100-fold by nature's own abundance in the space of minutes. She was adjusting her grip on the tarp when she looked across at Bo through the silver curtain of rain and found him already looking at her. His hair was plastered flat against his head. Water dripped from his chin and the collapsed brim of his hat. His shirt clung to his shoulders and chest, and his boots were standing in 2 inches of muddy water. He looked like a man who had been tossed fully clothed into a river. But his eyes held something she had never seen in them before, something warm and startled and wondering. The expression of a man who has walked into a room he has passed through 1,000 times and suddenly noticed that the light has changed and nothing looks the way he remembered. Maggie laughed. Not the careful, restrained laughter of social occasions or the bitter laughter of someone who has learned to find dark humor in disappointment. This was something else entirely. Pure and unguarded and reckless, the kind of laughter that comes from a place so deep inside that you did not know it still existed. The laugh of a child who has never been told that joy is something you are supposed to earn. The sound seemed to unlock something in Bo. His face changed, the careful reserve cracking open like drought-hardened earth receiving its first rain, and suddenly he was laughing too, rich and deep and utterly free, a sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. They stood there in the storm, 2 soaking wet people holding a canvas tarp between them and laughing like fools or saints while the drought-starved earth around them opened up and drank deep of unexpected mercy. The rain hammered down and the thunder rolled overhead, and the lightning turned the world to silver and shadow, and for one perfect suspended moment, nothing existed except water and laughter and the simple, impossible miracle of being alive in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. The storm lasted 47 minutes by Maggie's count, though it felt both longer and shorter than any 47 minutes she had ever lived. When the rain finally eased from roar to whisper to the steady drip of water finding its way off every surface, they walked through the yard surveying their harvest with the quiet satisfaction of soldiers who have won an important battle. Every container was full or overflowing. The bathtub had become a small reservoir, sending a stream across the yard toward the orchard. Puddles reflected the clearing sky, and somewhere in the distance, a bird began to sing. The first bird Maggie had heard since arriving at the homestead. "Look at them," Bo said, pointing toward the orchard. The peach trees had changed. Maggie could see it even through the lingering mist. Branches that had drooped with exhaustion seemed to have lifted, and leaves that had been curled tight against months of drought stress were already beginning to unfurl, spreading themselves open to receive whatever the sky might give next. The large tree by the creek stood tallest of all, its canopy dark with absorbed moisture, its roots drinking deep from soil that had finally remembered how to be soft. The cabin felt like sanctuary after the storm's wildness. Bo built up the fire in the cook stove while Maggie wrung water from her hair and tried to restore some semblance of order to her appearance, though the effort felt half-hearted and somehow unnecessary. The kitchen filled with steam from their wet clothes and the familiar smell of coffee beginning to percolate on the stove. They sat at the small table with cornbread and butter between them and the last of the thunder rumbling away to the east like a departing freight train. Maggie's hands had stopped shaking from the cold, but she could still feel the electric charge of the storm somewhere in her bones, humming like a tuning fork struck against stone. There was something she had not told Bo, not all of it. On the porch the day before, she had given him the facts of her situation, the broad strokes of accusation and closed doors. But the details, the ones that lived in the marrow of the memory, those she had kept behind a wall she had built so carefully, she sometimes forgot it was there. "Thomas had a cough," she said into the quiet kitchen. The words came without planning, as if the storm had loosened something inside her, along with everything else it had shaken free. "Started the first winter we were married. Just a small thing at first, the kind you wave away and say it is nothing. But it got worse every year. By the third winter, the handkerchiefs came away spotted red, and by the fourth, he could not climb the stairs without stopping twice to catch his breath." Bo set down his coffee but did not speak. He simply waited, giving her the silence she needed to find her way through it. "I nursed him for 11 months. 11 months of watching a gentle man fight for every breath like it was something he had to earn. His mother came to the house twice in 11 months. She stood in the doorway and told me I was not feeding him properly, that a real wife would have found better doctors, that if I had been the woman Thomas deserved, he would not be dying." Her voice did not break. It had gone past breaking, the way a bone heals crooked and becomes something harder than it was before. When he died, she came for the accounts, found them empty because there had never been anything in them. Thomas was a clerk. Clerks do not accumulate wealth, but she needed someone to blame, and a daughter-in-law with no family name was the easiest target she could find. She told the whole county I had stolen the Whitfield savings, and the whole county believed her, because that is what happens when a woman with nothing goes up against a name that has been carved into the courthouse wall for 3 generations. The rain dripped from the eaves. The fire crackled in the stove, and across the small table, Bo Tierney looked at her with eyes that held no pity, but something harder and more valuable. Understanding. The recognition of someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be judged by people who never bothered to learn the truth. "People who have been accused of things they did not do carry it different," he said. "Heavier, because you keep expecting someone to ask for your side of the story, and nobody ever does." Maggie stared at him across the lamplit table. Something between them crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, quiet as a root finding water in the dark. That evening, Opal Beckridge came to the cabin for the second time. She arrived without the carefully composed expression she had worn on her first visit. Her face was drawn and pale beneath her bonnet, and she carried a folded paper that she handled like it might bite. "Telegraph from town," she said without preamble. "Denton Whitmore is claiming that Mr. Tierney stole his intended bride. He is threatening charges, breach of contract, interference with lawful marriage arrangements." Bo read the telegraph in silence. His face hardened into something Maggie had not seen before, cold and distant as winter stone. "He says you were legally contracted to marry him," Bo said, his voice flat as still water. "Claims it amounts to theft of property." Property. The word landed in Maggie's chest like a fist. Opal delivered the rest of it in the grim, measured tone of someone who takes no pleasure in the message, but will not soften it to spare feelings. Whitmore wanted Maggie returned. Failing that, he wanted monetary compensation and what he called damage to his reputation. He had money and connections and the kind of social standing that carried weight in legal proceedings. But he married someone else, Maggie said. He abandoned the contract first. That is not how he is telling the story. The kitchen walls felt closer. The lamplight felt dimmer. And the future that Maggie had been carefully building in her mind, bucket by bucket and tree by tree, seemed to waver like a reflection in disturbed water. Then Opal said something that changed the shape of everything that came after. "I saw Lenore Farnham at church Sunday. That girl has not smiled once since her wedding day. Whatever you think of Mr. Whitmore's legal claims, Miss Whitfield, do not go back to that house." Maggie looked at the older woman and saw something she had not expected to find there. Not judgment, not disapproval, alliance, offered quietly and without ceremony, the way one survivor extends a hand to another across a divide that only they can see. Opal outlined the option with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had thought the problem through before arriving. If Maggie were married to someone else, Whitmore's contract would be void. No court in the territory would force a woman to break her marriage vows. Bo was quiet for a long time after Opal finished speaking. The lamp flickered between them, casting shadows on walls that had heard hard conversations before. "I would marry you tomorrow if it would keep you safe," he said. Not a declaration of love, not a promise of passion, something more solid than either. The words of a man offering to stand between a woman and a storm, not because standing there was easy, but because walking away was something he had tried before and could not survive doing again. "We should wait," Maggie said. "See if Whitmore actually follows through." She barely finished the sentence before a new sound reached them through the cabin walls. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses moving at a steady, purposeful pace through the darkness. Not the hurried gallop of emergency or the casual rhythm of neighbors. This was official business. The kind that arrived with badges and legal papers and the full weight of territorial law riding alongside. Bo rose from his chair. His hand moved automatically to check that his rifle was in its place by the door. "Stay inside," he said quietly. But Maggie was already at the window. 3 riders approached through the darkness, their forms outlined against a sky still scattered with storm-washed stars. Even in the dim light, she could make out the glint of metal on the lead rider's vest. The unmistakable badge of a man who carried the law in his pocket and used it the way other men used rope, to bind things that did not want to be bound. The sheriff did not waste time on pleasantries. He dismounted with the stiff movements of a man who had ridden hard through mud and standing water, his boots making wet, sucking sounds in the rain-soaked earth as he approached the porch. His name was not important. What was important was the badge on his chest, and the papers in his coat, and the 2 deputies who flanked him with their hands resting on their gun belts in the casual, purposeful way of men who expected compliance and were prepared for its absence. Bo Tierney. The sheriff's voice carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, the voice of a tool being wielded by a hand that was nowhere in sight. "That is me," Bo said from the porch. "Got papers here. Complaint filed by Denton Whitmore regarding breach of contract and interference with lawful marriage arrangements." He unfolded a document thick with official seals and territorial insignia, the kind of paper that carried more weight than wood or stone because it carried the weight of the system that created it. "Margaret Whitfield present? She is here. Need to speak with her as well." Maggie's breath caught as she moved toward the door. Her hand trembled on the wooden latch, and she had to try twice before she could work up the strength to turn it. The night air hit her face, carrying the smell of wet earth and something else, something metallic and cold that she would later recognize as the scent of her own fear. "Miss Whitfield." The sheriff's gaze cataloged her appearance with practiced thoroughness. The work dress, the calloused hands, the sunburned face, and the hair that had given up any pretense of propriety days ago. "You contracted to marry Denton Whitmore." "Yes, but..." "Contract is legal and binding according to territorial law. Mr. Whitmore is prepared to honor his commitments, provided you return to town immediately to fulfill your obligations." He married someone else. Temporary arrangement, easily dissolved once the original contract is properly fulfilled. The sheriff's tone suggested this was a minor detail, a clerical inconvenience hardly worth mentioning. "Mr. Whitmore is willing to overlook the delay and any circumstances that may have occurred during your absence. The pause before circumstances carried the weight of every ugly implication Denton Whitmore and his lawyers had planted. Maggie could see exactly what conclusions they had drawn about her time at Bo's homestead, what reputation they had already assigned to her. The same weapon that had been used against her in Virginia, wielded by different hands but cutting just as deep. I am not going back to him. Miss, you do not have much choice in the matter. The sheriff folded the papers and tucked them inside his coat with the finality of a door being locked from the outside. Contract law is clear as spring water. You took his money. You agreed to the terms. He is prepared to honor his part of the bargain. What about my part? Maggie's voice came out sharper than she intended, honed by something that had been building inside her since she first saw the bruise on Lenore Farnham's wrist. What about the fact that he abandoned the contract first by marrying another woman? That is a matter for the territorial courts to decide. Until then, you will be coming with us. She is not going anywhere. Bo's voice was quiet, but something in its texture made both deputies straighten and shift their weight, the involuntary response of men who recognize danger even when it speaks softly. Mr. Tierney, I would strongly advise you not to interfere with official territorial business. Official business built on lies and legal tricks. The sheriff's expression hardened. You calling Mr. Whitmore a liar? I'm calling him a man who married another woman and now wants to undo that mistake by claiming the first one was still available. Bo, don't! Maggie stepped between them, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat and her wrists and the backs of her eyes. It is not worth the trouble. Warrant has been issued, the sheriff said. Interference with lawful marriage contract. Harboring property subject to legal claim. Property. The word dropped through Maggie like a stone through water, falling past every defense she had built, past the pride that had kept her standing on that depot platform, past the strength that had carried water buckets until her palms split open, past the hope that had started growing in the dark like a seed reaching toward light it could not see. The word fell all the way to the bottom and hit something hard and cold and very old. The bedrock understanding that in the eyes of the law and the men who wielded it, she was not a person at all. She was inventory, merchandise. A line item in a contract between a man who wanted to own things and a system that was happy to help him do it. The sheriff produced a set of iron shackles from his belt. The metal gleamed dull in the lamplight spilling from the cabin doorway, and each link of the chain caught the light separately, like a series of small, cold eyes opening one after another. Please! The word slipped out before she could stop it. Small and broken and stripped of everything except the raw human need to not be treated like something less than human. Please do not put those on me. Sorry, miss. Orders are orders, and the law is the law. Maggie held out her hands with her wrists pressed together. The metal was cold against her skin, heavier than she had imagined, and when the shackles closed with a click that echoed through the night air, she felt something inside her close as well. Something that had been opening slowly over the past 3 days, unfurling like a drought-stressed leaf in sudden rain, now snapping shut again with a sound only she could hear. The iron cut into the tender skin of her wrists almost immediately. The weight pulled her arms down and made her shoulders ache with the sudden burden, and every movement produced a clanking that sounded like mockery, like the laughter of a system that had been designed by men who never had to wear what they created. This is wrong. Bo's voice was rough with something that might have been rage or grief or the particular agony of watching history repeat itself while being powerless to stop it. This is territorial law, the sheriff replied, and nodded to his deputies who moved to flank Maggie like guards escorting a dangerous prisoner. She stumbled back into the cabin to gather her things, the chains clanking with every step. Her hands shook as she tried to pack her few possessions into the carpet bag, the blue calico dress, the spare undergarments, her mother's Bible. Everything she owned, everything that proved she existed as a separate person with a separate life, fitting into a bag no larger than a grain sack. Bo stood in the doorway watching her pack. His expression was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life, no matter how long or short that turned out to be. Fury and helplessness and something deeper than both. The look of a man watching a tree being pulled up by its roots just as it was beginning to grow. "Take care of the trees," she said. Her voice barely carried above the rattle of chains. "Maggie, promise me." She looked up from her packing and met his eyes across the small room. "Whatever happens, do not let them die." His jaw worked silently. "Then I promise." The ride to town passed in a blur of darkness and mud and the steady clanking of chains against leather. Maggie sat behind one of the deputies, her shackled hands making it impossible to maintain balance. Every jolt sent the iron cutting deeper into her wrists, leaving welts that would scar. They rode through the orchard on their way to the main road, and Maggie looked at the large tree by the creek as they passed. In the faint starlight, she could see that its leaves had opened further since the rain, spreading wide and dark and alive against the pale sky. The tree was drinking. The tree was healing. The tree was choosing to live, and she was being dragged away in chains. The jail was a squat stone building at the edge of town. Maggie was processed with the efficient indifference used for livestock at market. Name recorded in a leather-bound book. Possessions cataloged and locked in a drawer. Cell assigned. The cell was barely large enough for the narrow cot and slop bucket. Walls of rough stone, still damp from the night's rain. A single window barred with iron as thick as a man's wrist. The sheriff claimed he had lost the key to the shackles, so Maggie sat on the edge of the cot, still wearing the iron that had already cut deep enough to draw blood in several places, and she stared at her bound hands in the gray light. But she did not cry, and she did not sleep. She thought. She went back over the contract in her mind, word by word, the way her father had taught her to go over account books when something did not add up. She remembered the date written at the top of the marriage agreement. She remembered the date Hank Dowling had told her about Denton's marriage to Lenore, and she counted the days, slowly and carefully, the way you count coins when the total matters more than anything else in the world. Denton Whitmore had married Lenore Farnham on Monday. The contract specified that Maggie would arrive on Tuesday. He had not waited for the appointed day. He had not honored even the basic timeline of his own agreement. He had broken the contract first, a full day before she ever stepped off that train. If Hank Dowling would swear to that timeline in a legal document, the contract was void on its face. Not because of the marriage to Bo, not because of any legal maneuver, but because Denton Whitmore himself had violated the terms before Maggie ever had the chance to fulfill hers. She turned this knowledge over in her mind like a stone in her palm, feeling its weight and its edges, understanding that it was a weapon, but only if she could find a way to use it before the system that had chained her decided her fate without asking her opinion. Dawn came gray and slow through the barred window. With it came the sound of footsteps in the corridor and the jangle of keys and a voice that made Maggie's breath catch in her chest. Bo stood in the doorway of her cell. His clothes were wrinkled and damp with morning dew. His hair was uncombed. Dark circles shadowed his eyes like bruises left by a night spent fighting something that could not be beaten with fists. He looked like a man who had been awake since the moment she was taken and had not stopped moving since. In one hand, he held a piece of paper covered in official seals. In the other, nothing at all, which somehow made him look braver than if he had been holding a weapon. "Maggie," he said, and his voice was rough with exhaustion and something else she would spend years learning to name. "Will you marry me?" right now. This morning. She stared at him through the iron bars and the gray light and the accumulated weight of everything that had happened since she stepped off that train. Already talked to Judge Poole, Bo continued. He is waiting at his house with all the proper papers. Soon as we are married, Whitmore's contract becomes void under territorial statute. Cannot force a woman to break marriage vows to honor a previous agreement. Maggie stood from the narrow cot, chains clanking like something from a nightmare that had followed her into waking. What about you? What about your farm? Your trees? Whitmore will not let this pass. Let me worry about Whitmore. I am worrying about him. And about you. She moved closer, the chains dragging against stone. You think marrying me will solve this? All it will do is paint a target on your back, too. Bo was quiet. Then he spoke, and his words came measured and deliberate as a man laying the foundation of something he intends to last. You remember what you said about the trees drinking after the rain? Been thinking about that all night. About how something that looks half dead can come back to life if it gets what it needs. His eyes met hers through the bars. No wavering, no doubt. Maybe that is what we both need. Someone willing to stand when the drought comes calling. Maggie felt the words land in her chest. Not a declaration of passion. Something more honest than passion and more durable. A partnership proposed in a jail cell by a man who had learned the hard way what happens when you let someone walk into the storm alone. Yes, she said. And then, because she was not a woman who waited to be saved even when she was standing in chains, she said something else. And I need you to find Hank Dowling, the station master. He can swear that Denton married Lenore on Monday, a full day before the contract date. Denton broke the agreement first. That is our real weapon, not just the marriage. Bo's face changed. She watched him take in what she was telling him, watched the implications register, watched a new kind of hope enter his expression that had nothing to do with legal maneuvering and everything to do with the realization that the woman he was about to marry was not someone who needed rescuing. She was someone who had spent the night in chains working out how to rescue them both. Footsteps in the corridor. Multiple sets, moving with the weight of authority and the particular confidence of money being spent to produce a desired result. Maggie heard Denton Whitmore's voice before she saw him, smooth and cultured. I trust there were no complications with the prisoner, Sheriff. None whatsoever, Mr. Whitmore. She has been waiting for you. Denton appeared in the corridor, tall, immaculate, radiating the cold satisfaction of a man who has placed his pieces exactly where he wants them and is waiting for the board to acknowledge his victory. His eyes swept over Maggie with the thoroughness of an auctioneer assessing merchandise, taking in the chains and the torn wrists and the dirt and the unwashed hair and the defiance she wore like armor. You look well rested, he said, and the words carried a cruelty so casual it barely registered as intentional. Actually, Bo said, his voice carrying clearly in the stone-walled space, there has been a change in circumstances. What kind of change? The kind that makes your contract worth about as much as dust in a windstorm. Bo moved to stand beside Maggie, close enough that she could feel heat radiating from his body through the cold prison air. Close enough that the meaning was unmistakable even before he spoke the words. Miss Whitfield is about to become Mrs. Tierney. The silence that followed was so complete, Maggie could hear water dripping somewhere deep in the building, each drop falling with the steady patience of time itself. Denton's face passed through several changes. Surprise. Calculation. Then something cold and reptilian that made Maggie think of a snake rearranging its coils. That is impossible. The woman is bound by legal contract. Actually, she can, said Judge Poole from the corridor behind them. The elderly judge squeezed past the deputies with a leather portfolio under his arm and the irritated expression of a man who had been roused from his breakfast for someone else's emergency. Marriage supersedes previous contracts of this nature, has for decades under territorial statute. Unless you have some legal grounds to prevent such a ceremony, Mr. Whitmore, I intend to perform one. The ceremony happened right there in the jail corridor, stone walls and iron bars for witnesses. Judge Poole read the legal requirements with brisk efficiency, his words echoing in the confined space. Maggie spoke her vows in a voice that only trembled slightly. Her hands still bore the fresh wounds where the shackles had bitten through skin, and she could feel blood drying in the creases of her palms. But her voice was clear, and her eyes were open, and she meant every word the way you mean something when it is the first truly free choice you have made in longer than you can remember. Bo's responses were steady and sure. The voice of a man who had spent a sleepless night deciding and was now at peace with what he had decided. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. The shackles were removed. The iron fell away with a sound like chains breaking in a story about deliverance, taking skin with it, leaving wounds that would heal white and crooked and permanent. Maggie rubbed her wrist and felt circulation return in agonizing tingles, while Bo stood beside her and looked at the marks on her skin with an expression that frightened her more than anything Denton Whitmore had ever said or done. Not anger. Something past anger. Something that lived in the place where grief becomes resolve. He took her hands in his, gently, the way you hold something that has been damaged and might break further if you are not careful. His thumbs traced the raw welts left by the iron, and his jaw worked silently, muscles clenching and unclenching. And when he spoke, his voice cracked down the middle, like dry wood splitting. I should have come sooner. You came, Maggie said. That is what matters. His eyes were wet. Not the single cinematic tear of a man performing emotion, but the real, uncontrolled welling of someone whose defenses have finally given way after being battered too long by too much. He blinked, and the tears fell, and he did not look away or apologize or try to pretend they were something other than what they were. Denton Whitmore watched all of this with the focused attention of a predator recalculating the distance to its prey. Congratulations, he said, and the word cut like glass. Enjoy your victory, Tierney. But remember that marriage contracts can be dissolved just as easily as they are created, especially when they are based on fraud. He walked away. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, steady and unhurried, the rhythm of a man who has lost a battle but has not conceded the war. They rode back to the homestead in the morning sun, Maggie sitting behind Bo on his horse with her arms around his waist and her torn wrists stinging in the dry air. She was married. She was free of the shackles. She was riding toward the only place in the world that felt like it might become home. But what waited for them proved that Denton Whitmore's revenge was already in motion. They smelled it before they saw it. The sharp, acrid bite of burned grass carrying on the morning breeze. As they crested the hill overlooking the homestead, Maggie saw a blackened scar running along the western fence line of the orchard, a strip of scorched earth 20 feet wide where someone had set fire to the dry grass during the night. The flames had burned themselves out before reaching the trees, stopped by the mud and standing water left by Thursday's storm, but the message was clear as a written threat nailed to their front door. This was not lightning, Bo said. His voice was flat and empty, the voice of a man adding up damages. Before they could fully absorb what the fire meant, another figure appeared walking between the rows of peach trees. A man in a business suit, clean boots leaving precise impressions in the mud, a leather portfolio thick with documents held against his chest. Mr. Tierney, I am Corwin Ledyard, representing the Cedar Falls Bank. I need to discuss your loan payment. The bank was calling in Bo's loan. All of it. $843, including fees and penalties that had materialized overnight like mushrooms after rain. Payment in full within 30 days or foreclosure proceedings would begin. Maggie asked to see the papers. Corwin Ledyard handed them over with the practiced indifference of a man who delivers bad news for a living. And Maggie read them the way her father had taught her to read account books, line by line, number by number, following the arithmetic the way a hunter follows tracks. "These 3 fees," she said, pointing to entries near the bottom of the second page. "Account review surcharge, domestic circumstance assessment, contract status verification." She looked up at Ledyard. "These do not exist in any standard loan agreement I have ever seen. Someone added them after the original document was signed." Ledyard's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. The small, involuntary flinch of a man who has been caught doing something he hoped no one would notice. "Those are standard bank procedures," he said. "No, they are not. And when Judge Poole reviews this document alongside the original loan agreement, he will see exactly what I see, which is that someone with influence over this bank has manufactured charges to destroy a man whose only crime was offering honest work to a woman who needed it." Ledyard gathered his papers and left without another word, his clean boots carrying him away through the mud of the orchard he had come to steal. Bo sat on the front porch after Ledyard was gone. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands, and he looked at the scorched fence line and the struggling trees and the mud-churned yard. And he said the words that Maggie had been dreading since the moment the shackles closed around her wrists. "Maybe they have already won." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from the burned grass, heavy and bitter and hard to breathe through. Maggie sat down beside him on the porch step. Their shoulders touched, and she could feel the exhaustion in him, the bone-deep weariness of a man who has been fighting alone for too long against enemies with more resources and fewer scruples. She looked at the orchard, at the trees they had watered together, bucket by bucket, at the large tree by the creek with its leaves spread wide and green after the storm, at the trench she had dug to save healthy roots from infected ones, at the scorched ground where someone had tried to burn it all down and failed because the rain had come first. "They have not won," she said quietly. Bo lifted his head and looked at her. "Because we are still here," Maggie said. "And tomorrow we are going to fight back." The plan came together the way water finds its path downhill. Not all at once, but with a steady gathering force that could not be stopped once it started moving. Maggie sat at the kitchen table that Friday afternoon, with Bo's original loan document spread flat beside the papers Corwin Ledyard had delivered that morning. She had borrowed a pencil from the small drawer beside the stove and was marking discrepancies in the margins. Her handwriting small and precise, the penmanship of a woman who had learned bookkeeping from a father who believed numbers never lied even when people did. 3 fabricated fees totaling $112. An interest calculation that used a rate 2 points higher than what was written in the original agreement. A penalty for late payment that was dated 3 weeks before the actual due date. Someone at the Cedar Falls Bank had done this work in a hurry, counting on the assumption that a struggling farmer would be too exhausted or too uneducated to read the fine print. They had not counted on Maggie. "Here is what we are going to do," she said when Bo came in from checking the orchard for further signs of sabotage. 3 things. First, we stop trying to save every tree and focus on the ones that can survive. 8, maybe 10, transplanted closer to the creek where they can be watered without killing ourselves. The cleared land gets planted with fast-growing vegetables. Beans, corn, squash. Things that produce in weeks, not months. Bo leaned against the doorframe, listening with the careful attention of a man who has learned to recognize competence. Second, we need Hank Dowling. He was there when I arrived. He knows exactly when Denton married Lenore, and it was Monday, a full day before the contract date. A sworn statement from Hank proves Denton broke the agreement first. That voids everything. Not just because of our marriage, but because his own claim is fraudulent from the start. And third, Maggie tapped the bank papers with her pencil. These fabricated fees go before Judge Poole, along with the original loan agreement that shows none of them existed when you signed. Someone at the bank added charges after the fact under pressure from Denton Whitmore, and a territorial judge is not going to look kindly on that, especially when it amounts to using the legal system to punish a man for marrying a woman that someone else decided he owned. Bo studied her face in the afternoon light. She could see him taking in not just what she was saying, but who she was while saying it. A woman who had spent a night in chains and come out the other side not broken, but sharpened. The way a blade is sharpened by the stone that grinds against it. Maggie reached into the small room off the kitchen and came back with the leather pouch from beneath her pillow. She loosened the drawstring and poured the contents onto the table between them. $38.50 in coins and small bills, each one representing a sacrifice so minor it would have been invisible to anyone who had never learned to count the cost of everything. "I'm not giving you my savings," she said. "I am investing them. In the seeds. In the tools we need. In us." Bo stared at the money, then at her face. His expression held something that lived beyond gratitude, beyond surprise. In the territory where one person recognizes that another has chosen to stand beside them. Not because the standing is easy, but because the alternative is something neither of them can live with. "Maggie, I cannot. You are not taking. I am giving. There is a difference." She pressed the pouch into his hands and felt the calluses on his palms, the rough, honest geography of a man's labor mapped in skin. "And tomorrow we start building something that belongs to both of us." They began work at dawn on Saturday. By mid-morning, they were not alone. Opal Beckridge arrived first, which surprised Maggie more than anything that had happened since she stepped off that train. The older woman climbed down from her black buggy carrying a pot of beef stew large enough to feed a crew, her face set in the determined expression of someone who has made a decision and does not intend to explain it. "I told you this path ends badly," Opal said, setting the pot on the porch railing. She looked at Maggie with eyes that held 30 years of their own hard walking. "I was wrong. Sometimes the narrow path is the only honest one." Then she rolled up her sleeves, and Maggie understood that this was Opal Beckridge's way of saying everything she could not put into words. An apology and an offering and a recognition, all compressed into the simple act of showing up with food and willing hands. The preacher's wife came next with fresh bread and coffee, then Asa Milford from the neighboring farm, a quiet man with enormous hands who picked up a shovel and started digging without asking where or why. His 2 grown sons followed, and after them came the blacksmith and the feed store owner, working side by side in the dirt like men who had remembered something important about what it meant to live in the same valley as other people. "Heard you folks might need some help," Asa said with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who understood that communities survive by carrying each other's weight when the load gets too heavy for one person to bear alone. Maggie watched in amazement as their small, desperate project became something larger. Not just 2 people trying to save themselves, but a community recognizing that what happened to one household happened to all of them. That the same power that could chain a woman and burn a fence line and fabricate bank charges could turn its attention to any of them whenever it chose. By evening, 6 trees had been successfully transplanted to the sheltered ground near the creek, their roots carefully wrapped and watered in soil that was still soft from Thursday's storm. The cleared orchard land had been turned and marked for planting. Dark earth exposed to air for the first time in years, rich and promising beneath the exhausted surface. And Hank Dowling came. He rode out from town in the late afternoon, carrying a document he had written himself and signed before a notary at the land office. A sworn statement that Denton Whitmore had married Lenore Farnham on Monday, September the 10th, a full day before the contract date of September the 11th. A full day before Maggie Whitfield ever set foot in Cedar Falls. There was more. Lenore Farnham had left Denton's house 2 nights ago. She was sheltering at Mrs. Crawford's boarding house on Elm Street, and she was willing to testify about things that went on behind the closed doors of the Whitmore residence, things that left bruises shaped like fingers and fear shaped like a permanent flinch. Judge Poole reviewed the sworn statement and the fabricated bank charges on Sunday morning. By Sunday afternoon, he had dismissed Denton Whitmore's claims in their entirety and ordered a full audit of the Cedar Falls Bank's lending practices. The contract was void. The marriage stood. The farm was theirs. Denton Whitmore came to the homestead one final time. He rode up the main road on Monday morning with the unhurried pace of a man who still believed that the world arranged itself according to his preferences. But when he crested the hill and looked down at the Tierney homestead, what he found waiting was not a desperate couple standing alone against his power. Asa Milford stood near the barn with a shovel resting against his shoulder. The blacksmith leaned against the fence with his arms crossed over a chest built by years of working iron. Opal Beckridge sat on the porch in a straight-back chair with a cup of coffee and an expression that could have frozen creek water in July. Even Hank Dowling was there, standing quietly near his horse, with the calm certainty of a man who has told the truth and is prepared to tell it again as many times as necessary. And in front of them all stood Maggie Tierney, 5 feet 4 inches of sunburned skin and calloused hands and a spine that had been tested by everything a person could throw at it and had not bent once. "You called me property, Mr. Whitmore." Maggie's voice carried clear across the yard, steady as the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the land she now called home. But property does not fight back. "I do." Denton looked at the faces arrayed before him. The community he had assumed would always defer to his money and his name, standing in the dirt of a struggling farm, choosing sides in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. His jaw worked silently. His hands tightened on the reins until his knuckles went white. Then he turned his horse and rode away without saying a word, and the sound of hoofbeats fading down the road was the sound of a door closing on a chapter that was finally, truly finished. The house was quiet that evening. The neighbors had gone home with promises to return for planting. The stew pot was empty. The tools were cleaned and stored. The 6 transplanted peach trees stood in their new home near the creek, leaves rustling softly in a breeze that carried the faintest memory of Thursday's rain. Maggie was washing dishes in the basin when she heard Bo come in from the porch. His footsteps paused in the kitchen doorway, and the quality of his silence made her turn around with her hands still dripping soapy water. He was holding the iron key. She had seen it every day since she arrived, hanging on its nail beside the front door, dark with age and worn smooth by generations of hands. She had asked about it once and been told it was nothing important. Bo crossed the kitchen and held it out to her, resting in his open palm like an offering laid on an altar. "This opens the front door," he said. "Been in my family 3 generations. My grandfather made it when he built this cabin. Passed it down to my father when he married my mother, and my father gave it to me with one instruction. He said, 'You will know when you have found the person this belongs to, because she will be the one who stays when staying gets hard.'" His voice caught on the last word, not breaking, but bending, the way strong wood bends under weight it was built to bear. "I told you it was nothing important." He paused. I was wrong. It is the most important thing I own, and it is yours, for as long as you want it." Maggie reached out and took the key. The metal was warm from his hand, heavy with the particular weight of objects that have been carried through time by people who understood their worth. She closed her fingers around it and felt the worn edges press into her palm, fitting against her skin, as if the key had been waiting for exactly this hand to hold it. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words held more weight than the vows they had spoken in a jail corridor with iron bars for witnesses and shackle wounds still bleeding on her wrists. She walked out into the evening air and crossed the yard to the orchard. The large peach tree by the creek stood dark against a sky scattered with early stars, its branches spread wide, its leaves full and green, its roots reaching deep into soil that was finally, after months of desperate thirst, learning how to be soft again. She placed her palm against the bark and felt the tree's life humming beneath the surface, patient and persistent, the quiet pulse of something that had chosen to survive. Bo came to stand beside her. Their shoulders touched, and neither of them moved away. She had come west looking for one kind of future and found that door slammed shut in her face. But standing here in the cool September darkness with a key in her hand and a man beside her who understood that partnership was worth more than passion and stubbornness was worth more than surrender, Maggie Whitfield Tierney understood something that the girl who had stepped off that train 4 days ago could not have known. Sometimes the life we think we want is not half as good as the one we never saw coming. Far down the road, she could hear hoofbeats, distant and fading, heading away from the homestead, away from the valley, away from everything that had tried to break her and failed. Maggie did not turn to look. She kept her hand on the tree and her shoulder against Bo's warmth and her face toward the stars, and the old iron key lay solid in her palm, no longer waiting, no longer a question hanging unanswered on a nail by the door. It was home now, and so was she.